Hi, my name's Calum Douglas, author of the World War II engines book, The Secret Horsepower Race, which is a rather weighty tome on World War II engine development, published by Morton's. And the publisher sent me a list of 13 questions you'd like answered, so I'm going to try to elaborate on them a little bit more for you. So the first question I've had is, why did the Germans not just decide to copy the Mosquito? And that's a really good question, actually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read for you some of the stenographic record meeting minutes. And this is a discussion between Milch, Messerschmitt and Goering on Wednesday the 15th of March 1943 at Carron Hall. And so this is Goering speaking now. When the war broke out, I demanded we have a wooden aeroplane because it did no harm to build additional wooden fighters and a bomber. But all I was told in return was, it's impossible. You can't expect anyone to agree to pilot such a thing. The whole world will laugh at us. Now they can laugh at us because we don't have one. The day before yesterday, the Mosquitoes made a deep attack on Paderborn again, and they didn't lose one machine. Our fighters didn't see it. The Mosquitoes flew around like they were the stupid ones, in broad daylight, only trusting their speed. Although they came in at just 50 metres altitude, with no weapons at all, relying on their speed, they've made it home. You can go and look at this plane so that you can learn something about the, quote, primitive nature of it. Again, I say it. Why the long search? Let's build the Mosquito. It's the simplest thing we can do. Messerschmitt responds that it's in no way easy to design a wooden plane, even from an existing baseline. Goering replies, I'm telling you directly, just build the Mosquito. Messerschmitt says, so we can build more or less any plane. Goering says, so why not just make the best one? Messerschmitt comes back with, I think it's very complicated. The timber construction is by no means simpler. Goering, well, it's simpler than some of your aircraft. Messerschmitt, this aircraft is very light on equipment. It has no armament at all. Goering, that's not true. The English have two types, one with very decent armament. So the discussion carries on for a long time, but essentially it comes down to the fact that it's really hard work just to copy someone else's plane, because the manufacturing techniques, it's a composite construction. It's not very easy to do. So you could copy the shape, but actually by the time you learned how to build it properly with all the process control and molds and so on, Messerschmitt's point was that you might as well just build your own one from scratch. And you can argue about if that's the right choice or not, but anyway, that's basically, as far as I can tell, why they didn't just build one on their own. So the second question I've got is that the Napier Sabre was a very powerful engine, but why did it take so long to develop? If the government had more resources, could the Sabre have become more successful than the Merlin? So that's a pretty tricky one, but let's just bring up a couple of pictures. So what you should be looking at here, so this is a German study of the Sabre, and what you really have to keep in mind with the sleeve valve engine is that basically you've got a little rotor here with a mechanism on the bottom of the sleeve, and this is basically moving up and down and spinning in a kind of ellipse. And what you've really got to remember is that this liner here, I hope you can see my mouse pointer, that's 2.5 millimeters thick. It's really thin, and you can't make it very thick because A, the engine will become too heavy, B, the heat transfer through the liner will be too degraded, and secondly, these things have got to move quite fast, and if they become too heavy, it'll take too much force to drive them, and the stresses on all this drive gear here will become impossible. The trouble is that when you've got very high gas pressures in the engine, the piston will basically try to deform this thin liner here, because as the gas pressures go up, the piston thrust loads go up, which are forced sideways into this ring here. And if this ring is forced out of round, it basically begins to rub against the engine too much, and it'll wear out, and eventually it can jam. So the problem with the sleeve valve concept is that to get these things to stay round and to not jam with these tiny gaps here, because if the gap's too big, the oil will just leak past and all go out the exhaust. So this is a precision fit, and the reason it took so long to develop is that to get the metallurgy right, it took Bristol about 5 years, and they actually had a company called Firth Brown do most of the metallurgical research, and they had to do about 1,000 different trials of different alloys to get a liner that stayed round and didn't jam. And basically with a poppet valve like a Merlin, it's just much simpler, and when you increase the boost pressure you have far fewer problems with the liners jamming, because they don't move, obviously, and essentially that limits the boost you can put through the Sabre. The Sabre's a great engine. I really hope people get them flying today, but the sleeve valve is inherently not that suited to very high boost pressures, and because the Merlin was eventually, even though it's a pretty simple engine, which you could even call a bit boring and conventional in some respects, because it works, if you've got the fuel to do it, you can outboost other engines which might look a bit more advanced and impressive. So I think that's really the very short version of why the Sabre didn't displace the Merlin as a fighter engine in the war, really, to the extent that it could have done. Just I've got another view for you here. You'll see these are all in German. These are German studies of the Sabre. So you can see that's the motion that the ports move in the Sabre, and you can see that's a top view of the liner. So this thing is basically moving back and forth, and you've got the inlet ports here, and then the exhaust ports here. So these cutouts are moving back and forth over these slots, and if you start putting loads on here, it starts sort of clipping the entry of that when it moves, and it all starts wearing out. It's really difficult to get that to work well with high boost pressures. So that's a little overview of that for you. Next question I've got is, the Americans mass-produced the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Did they build more Merlins than the British, and did they seek to take credit for the Mustang's success? That's a bit of a long story, but I think what a lot of people don't appreciate to the degree they ought to is how much of a collaborative effort the Packard Merlin was. I think some people seem to think that Rolls-Royce sent them the drawings and Packard went off and just did everything on their own after that, and it was actually a much more collaborative effort. So this is Mr. Vincent. So Vincent was one of the senior designers at Packard, and this is 30th of April 1943. So this is covering his trip to England, and he's basically, this is one of his diaries where he's recording all the discussions with the British designers at Rolls-Royce and so on. So just for an example here, let's just have a look. So Tuesday, May the 18th, 1943, hives, so that's obviously the chief of Rolls-Royce, and Mr. Eller went to Ministry of Aircraft Production headquarters, where they met Banks, FR Banks, and talked about the spark plugs, the boost levels, etc., etc., etc. Conference with Sir Stafford Cripps, Minister of Air, and so I hope you can just see from all these conference details that actually it was a very collaborative effort, and Rolls-Royce had sent 3 of their best people permanently to America once the development project had started. So I don't think you can call the Packard Merlin 100% American. I think it was a very collaborative effort, and that applies to a lot of the developments in the war. The British and American efforts became so intertwined. I don't think it's reasonable to take any engine or development and put any particular flag on it between America and Britain in many cases. I think it was too much of a combined effort to do that. Packard did try to take a lot of credit for the success of the Merlin, justifiably in my view, because they really did what Britain ought to have done a very long time before and put a pressure carburettor on it, which made a big difference, and I think Packard were quite right to be quite pleased with themselves about that. Having said all that, most Merlins were made in Britain, but this is another long story, and if you read the book you'll find out a bit more about that. So the next question I've got, early on Focke-Wulf seems to have thought that the BMW 801 had limited potential. Was it an engineering dead end, or could it have been developed further? So that's not a bad question. So I don't think it was an engineering dead end. It certainly wasn't any more primitive than a lot of the really successful radial engines, but partially due to its lineage coming from license-built American radials from the early 30s, the supercharger, which was reasonable for that time, by the time it had been taken forward and gotten to about 1941, even with some updates, it was pretty poor. And really what BMW should have been encouraged to do more is develop what you can see on the screen, which is the BMW TJ turbocharger for the BMW 801, which eventually flew in tiny numbers just before the end of the war in things like the Junkers 388. And so, no, I don't think it was a developmental dead end, and I think they should have turbocharged it at a much earlier point. So the next question is, what was the biggest mistake that the British made in engine design and manufacturing during World War II? That's multifaceted, but the biggest mistake, if I'm forced to single out one, is when they ignored the recommendations of probably the world's most famous engine development scientist in the 1920s and 30s, which is Sir Harry Ricardo, who as early as 1927 had been carrying out very successful development reports on fuel injection on the south coast of Britain, and this was thoroughly and studiously ignored by the British, and I think that's their greatest mistake of the period. If I had been in charge of aero engine design and production in Germany from 1939 until the end of the war, what would you have done differently from what happened, if anything? That's a pretty tricky one. I think essentially this is a bit of a cheat answer, but and one that I shouldn't really give because my book's about piston engines. 1939 is probably too late to do anything, and I think if I'd been there in 1939 as the start point, I probably would have just got a plane ticket to Argentina, I think. But that's a bit of a cop-out answer, so I think the next thing I probably would have done is to tell everyone to stop making piston engines and throw everything away that wasn't the Messerschmitt 262. I think that was the best bet. If that's an unsatisfactory answer for you, I think that because it takes 5 years to develop a new engine type, 1939 is too late to change the course of the war. And I think if I had a time machine and I was so inclined to go back and help the Germans, I would have needed to parachute myself in about 1935, I think. And I think I would have concentrated on the Junkers Yomo 213. The next question is, had the jet engine not come along, what would be the limitation for propeller fighters? Well, I think we've got a pretty good indication for that from the activities in America at the Reno air races. So I think this is the plane which sort of unofficially is the world's fastest piston engine plane for some irritating legal reasons. But it looks like a P-51 because it is. And so I think you can roughly take the performance of a Reno racer and say, well, that's what the limit probably is. So it's about 550 miles an hour, but that's in something that's going to last about 10 minutes. So the answer is that the limit is somewhere between World War II performance and what the Reno racers are doing today. So that's a sort of bracket for you. And what would actually have happened, I don't know. The next question is, the book starts with progress made on the later years of the Schneider Trophy. Have you come up with anything to go from Pioneer Flight in World War I, which could be considered a prequel? No, but the closest thing I can come up with for you, I would say, is if you go to the National Archives and you go and get, what have we got here? Air 5 1369. So this is a history of the Bristol Aero Engine Department written by Fedden, and it's obviously just talking about Bristol, but it's actually a very, very good history of aero engines from about 1918 up to the start of World War II. So this is probably the best recommendation I have for something for you to read that will give you a bit of a prequel. The next question, what can I tell you about my work in Formula One? Not very much, because like all engineers who work in Formula One, you have to sign a confidentiality agreement, and it doesn't mean anything special. That's what everyone has to do, even if you design washers. The only thing I can tell you is that when I was working at Mercedes, I was working on the engine for the AMG Project 1, which is to adapt the V6 turbo compound F1 engine to be used in the supercar, the AMG Project 1. And that's all I can tell you, because I'm not allowed to say anything else. And the next question, what's my top engine airframe combination for World War II? I think number one is the Mosquito, because I think that the way the radiator was done is really outstanding, and I think it's a really good example of good integration of the engine and the cooling system in a way that doesn't damage the aerodynamics, which frequently happened with many planes. I think number two has to be the Mustang, and this is a pretty blurry photo, but there's always a lot of debate about the laminar flow wings. So this is a Mustang wing in a German wind tunnel, and I can tell you that the Mustang laminar flow wing works very well indeed. And so I think really that's one reason why I have to say the Mustang Merlin engine combination is a very, very good one. The final one I think has to be the FW190D D9 with the UMO 213. I think really just because it looks like quite a brutal thing, and I really like the nose-mounted ring radiator. I think they're pretty good. I think it's really ends up a bit being like an air-cooled installation there, and I just really like the shape. The next question is, why didn't the Italians capitalise on their Schneider trophy engines in the same way that the British did? I think that's a really good question, but I think what you need to bear in mind, and I'm not trying to denigrate it here, is that the MC72 and the Fiat ES6 engine may have been very fast, but the AS6, aside from the fact that they did clever stuff to get two engines to work together like that, the individual engines were, even by that point, not terribly advanced. So you can get a bit confused by looking at that and thinking they ought to have done a lot better. I think that the basic engine that was used to make that double engine was already verging on being a bit average by 1931, and I think the start point is maybe not quite as impressive as you might think, purely from the point of engine technology. And as far as we know, I'm still looking for the documents, sometime in the mid-30s the Italian Air Ministry decided to realign all their development work away from liquid-cooled engines to building air-cooled engines, and I think that was a huge mistake, and that really did throw away all the work they had started to do, and they had to reverse that in quick fashion from something like 1939, and you'll see engines like the Fiat A38 being designed in 1939, and they've got all these crazy concepts, and I think they just had a panic at the last moment and thought, wow, we really need to get going with liquid-cooled engines again, but it's just much too late. And you can see how rushed they were, because the engines are sort of, they look a bit like, in terms of the cylinders, they're a bit like a sort of hybrid Merlin and a Daimler. So they've obviously just not had time to do all the development, and they've just had to copy bits from here and there, and it was too late, and they had wasted too much time, and I think the interference from the Air Ministry had been very negative. So that's briefly what happened there. The next question is, what's the single greatest performance leap at the time? Well, it's a bit of a cliche to say so, but it has to be the fuel. And so, for example, if we look at, so this is a fuel test for a Daimler-Benz single-cylinder engine, that's why it's 6001, of 3 different fuels, and this is basically the brake mean effective pressure, but you can just look at that as a sort of engine power sort of a scale, and that's the air fuel ratio. So that's very lean here, and that's very rich here, and the bottom one is B4, so that's what they fought most of World War II on, and on average it's making about 8 bar BMEP up to a maximum of 10. ET100 is basically pure iso-octane, and they didn't have enough of that to make that into the fuel, but that's sort of the primary constituent of allied 100-octane fuel, and you can basically see you've almost doubled the engine power. So it's a monumental difference in engine power, and I think you can see just you're never going to get any other single change which is going to do anything like that. Never going to happen. The CV2B is the sort of German attempt at copying this, and because of the different compounds they had available, they ended up being very good here and not very good here, but they didn't ever manage to make enough of this particular fuel to use in service. But so the biggest change is fuels, basically. And the final question is, would the HispanoSyriza 12Y have been capable of the same kind of development as the DB600 and the Merlin? No. That's not a very good answer, is it? But well, yes and no. But it would have been had to be changed so much that you're really talking about a new engine. So if we just have a look through the manual here. So firstly, you've only got 2 valves per cylinder, so that's not going to work. You're going to need 4. And secondly, if I can just find the right image to show you, the other main problem it really had, which I'm going to show you a picture of in a moment, is that all the exhaust and inlet ports are on the same side of the cylinder head, and that's basically an extremely primitive way of organising the cylinder head, essentially because if all the ports are on the same side of the engine, the heat from the exhaust heats up the inlet charge, and you're basically putting heat into the engine where you don't want it, and this is a really big limitation. So the inlet and exhaust ports on the 12Y come on are on the same side of the cylinder head. So I think that's really a pretty serious limitation. So looking at the rest of the engine as well, if you look at the connecting rod here, this is basically just a cylinder, and it's really pretty primitive. And so I think it would have needed so much development work that it really would have been a different engine. So I think I don't think that it's viable to develop the 12Y in the same way as either of those 2 engines. So thanks very much for listening to all that. I hope I've provided some new information for you, and you'll find increased amounts of information to help you with all of those in the book, which I recommend you get from Morton's Direct. So thanks very much.